Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. Even with global warming, the South Pole is still bitterly cold. At McMurdo Station, where the U.S. has its main base there, the mean annual temperature is 0 degrees Fahrenheit, a little warmer along the coast, about 14 degrees. Well, today you can keep warm against those temperatures, but not back in 1820 when Nathaniel Palmer of Stonington, Connecticut became the first American and arguably the first human to ever lay eyes on the continent of Antarctica. Well, here to tell us about Mr. Palmer is the lead docent at the Nathaniel Palmer House, which is also the headquarters of the Stonington Historical Society, June Froh. June is going to be along in just a moment to tell us about this great maritime tale. This week's trivia question: a lot of people like to claim that he spent the night with them. Who was he? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. Yale New Haven Hospital was the very first hospital in Connecticut. They opened their doors 200 years ago and later introduced the entire country to the use of penicillin and chemotherapy. Today, some of the brightest minds in medicine choose to work there, and it's the primary teaching hospital for the prestigious Yale School of Medicine. For more information, log on to ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. Well, there's nothing like a good seafaring tale to spruce up the day, and boy, do we have one for you today. Well, as we've discussed in several previous episodes and will continue to examine in future ones, Connecticut played a very big role in the development of the country after European settlers arrived, and in no small part because of all the boating and shipping that occurred along the Connecticut coastline. Well, we did do an episode, you may recall, on the whaling industry, but even before whaling began, sea captains took to the high seas in search of seals. Yes, seal hunting, or sealing as it was called. Well, that ran into the same problem as whaling because fishermen simply took too many of them, depleted their numbers, and had to scramble for a substitute, which in this case turned out to be whales. Well, the young towns and cities that sprang up along the Connecticut coastline back in the 1600s and 1700s were the ones that tended to play the biggest role in shipping. And those communities that were located closest to the Atlantic Ocean further east had an even bigger advantage. Now, think of places like Mystic, New London, Old Saybrook, Groton, Essex. But the community that was actually the best situated, geographically speaking, was Stonington. You literally couldn't get any closer to the Atlantic Ocean and still be in Connecticut than by being in Stonington. So it really shouldn't come as any surprise that some formidable shipping exploits occurred out of Stonington, and some famous names in maritime history had their start there. On today's episode, we're going to focus on none other than Nathaniel Palmer. He was the first American, without question, to set his eyes on the continent of Antarctica. And it seems quite possible, frankly, that he was also the first human anywhere on the globe to see it. And he did this at the ripe old age of 21. Well, we're going to hear the story today from June Froh. She's the lead docent at the Nathaniel Palmer House in Stonington. Now, that's a house that was built by Nathaniel Palmer, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places. It also doubles as the headquarters of the Stonington Historical Society. Now, it's open for tours at the right time of year. You have to call ahead, of course, and that's where you'll find June Froh. She's said to be their top tour guide or docent and a former teacher who's done quite a bit of research on Nathaniel Palmer. Now, because docents tend to speak in the language of the time they're conveying, you're going to hear her use the word rookery. Well, I had to look that up. It's a gathering of sea mammals, in this case seals, where they get together, hang out in groups, and, well, that makes them ripe for hunting. June, I want to start off trying to put this in the proper context. Now, here we are, the year is 2023, and it was 203 years ago that we had never heard about Antarctica. We didn't even know it existed. And to put that in some context, there are a lot of people who tend to forget that Hawaii and Alaska didn't become U.S. states until 1959. So they haven't even been around 70 years. But, we had the whole whaling industry came after the seal hunting industry, and Nathaniel Palmer was part of this. So try and put Stonington for a second in that perspective. Where was it?
Stonington was very much a seafaring town. That goes without saying. And in fact, if we look a little bit earlier at the 18th century, the middle of that century was when that village really started to be populated, when houses started to be built. But actually, boats were built here long before housing started to crop up. So I think it was almost destiny that this was going to be a shipbuilding area, one that people looked to for direction on how to build boats safely. It was a place that, as you said, sealing kind of put Stonington on the map first before whaling came into place. And sealing, in fact, was something, therefore, that we hear a little bit less about. It was a venture that was dangerous, lucrative, challenging, and probably overall not a very pleasant topic to talk about, as was not whaling. But nevertheless, it brought significant wealth to this community, as did whaling afterwards, no question about it. But it was a remarkable village that gained quite a bit of notoriety as a result.
Now, there was some obvious competition here. I mean, you look at a map of New England, and of course you see, Boston, and you see New Bedford, and you see Newport, and then you come down, and the furthest east you can get in Connecticut and still be in Connecticut is Stonington. So they had the best chance, I guess. It's the only town in Connecticut. I love this little trivia question. It's the only town in Connecticut where you can go to the shoreline and enter both Long Island Sound and the Atlantic Ocean.
Correct. So it has sort of direct access to the Atlantic. So it became a place where vessels could come in and have some reasonable shelter, both from Fisher's Island and from the little bit of Rhode Island that was sticking out into the water as well. So it was a safe harbor, and it was a place that people looked to indeed for shelter and repairs.
Yeah, could you explain? I don't think people really think of Stonington as a shipbuilding area. I don't think it gets its true due in that regard. Could you tell us what kind of ships, like how big were they and what were they used for?
Well, they ranged in size, certainly from small fishing vessels. This is clearly a fishing port as well as a port from which sealers and whalers set sail. But we're talking a vessel that could be anywhere in length from 40 feet up to perhaps 120 or greater. And these were schooners, they were brigs, and eventually, even though clippers were typically not built here, many of them were certainly designed here, as we know Nathaniel goes on to do. Mystic naturally gets a little bit more notoriety in terms of the clipper ship building. Nathaniel's father, as you may know, had a boatyard right across the street from the Palmer House, which is still a boatyard to this day. So he was building all manner of wooden sailing ships. So I imagine the size range was dependent on the need.
So from the old adage of the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, his dad is building these ships, and Nathaniel's born just before 1800s, is 1799. And by teenage years, he's already out on the water.
That's correct. And as you may know, he left school at the age of 14. I don't believe he was much of a scholar, but a brilliant man in so many other ways. And he did go to serve immediately on board a British blockade runner, which during the War of 1812 was a dangerous proposition for any man, young or old. And he got to know the waters. He was looking for opportunity, and he certainly found it. So he got to take the helm once in a while, I understand, learn all the jobs on a boat from such a young age. And indeed, inspired by his father to a degree, that was his playground often after school, was to run down to the boatyard and watch men build these seaworthy vessels. And, he tucked that knowledge away for later on.
It's almost embarrassing to look back now and see what ages people accomplish things at. So, for example, he was 19 when he became captain of his first ship. Not something you would see today. I think it was, if I'm pronouncing it right, the Galena was his first ship. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
The vessel itself was a schooner, And many of the schooners back in the day were what we call coastal schooners. So they're running up and down the East Coast. It's a merchant ship, really. That was his first captaincy, which is, all the more interesting because when he makes his first voyage down to Antarctica, he actually is only serving as a second mate. So the Galena was his training ground and certainly put him on the map in terms of people noticing him.
So now let's do this. Let's fast forward now to 2 years later. It's now 1820. It's November, and the seal industry has run into some rough waters, no pun intended, but they've overhunted, and the seal population is down, and they have to go further and further south, and that's kind of the situation that led to Nathaniel Palmer getting his notoriety, correct?
Correct. Yeah. For any sailor who's venturing in that neck of the woods, clearly we all know that the waters are treacherous, the winds whip around Cape Horn, and going ever farther south, as you say, was a necessity because they are depleting the populations on the way. So he is sent out as a scout, you probably realize, in 1820 to look for more rookeries.
And I think it's important for people to know that there were no maps of where he was going. I mean, this is your true uncharted territory type of exploration that he was doing, correct?
That is correct. And he realized that when he took his bearings on that day in November of 1820, that he had reached an area that was not on any charts, on any notes that were known to him or had been previously recorded and at least shared in the maritime world. So if there was any other notes out there, he was unaware of it.
How big was the boat?
The Hero was 47 feet in length. It had a shallow draft in it, which enabled him as the scout to go look for rookeries in areas that were perhaps a bit dicey in terms of their depth. But he had an innate ability to read the water, meaning the depth of the water. That was something that was just immeasurably important.
And how many other people were on that boat with him?
4 others. They were all local men, one the same age, family friend. 2 of them were older, and one was only 16 years old. All local men that he trusted implicitly, I'm sure.
And usually when you hear about these outings, they lasted months at a time. Was that the case with the Hero?
That is correct. It depended certainly on how well they were doing, how the harvest went, so to speak. But they would be gone probably 5 to 6 months, certainly trying to bring back as much cargo as they can.
Now let's take this head on. There are 2 other sea captains who claim they spotted Antarctica before Nathaniel Palmer, one from Russia, one from England. And yet nobody has named anything after them in Antarctica, like the Palmer Station, the research station from the U.S. that's named for him. And I guess some of the current maps even still call it Palmer Land. But what do we know about this Russian and English seafarers who supposedly found Antarctica before Nathaniel?
Well, exactly what you're saying. We don't know a great deal. The claims were made by the British, for example, that they had spotted that land 12 months earlier. The Russian was making similar claims. The difference being that the story goes that the Russian commander, he's sent by the Tsar just to go exploring. He wasn't necessarily sealing. That he met Nathaniel one foggy morning and said to him, "Where have you been?" and was rather belligerent about it. He asked Nathaniel to show him his logbook, which supposedly Nathaniel did. And he was rather surprised and was taken aback by it, but at the same time, quite admiring of him. He said, "Well, you traveled all this way in such a small vessel. This is remarkable." So his claims and those of the British, those claims are probably going to be discussed till the end of time. I don't know exactly if there's any concrete conclusions have been made, but certainly what we do say with certainty is Nathaniel was the first American to sight Antarctica and record it. And the fact that there's a British man by the name of Powell, whose 1822 map refers to Nat's sightings and recordings, to me just gives credence really to the fact that Nathaniel had been in an area that nobody else had.
So what happens to Nathaniel Palmer when he comes back? I mean, You talk about these great fish stories, and, boy, now I found this landmass in the South. Did people believe him when he came back?
That is an excellent question. And I have to say, I don't have a firm answer to that. Those are things that I also would like to know. Knowing what I do about his character, I suspect that he was probably rather shocked by it all, and probably a very modest man. I would suspect that he was not overwhelmed by the notoriety, that in fact, he never set out to discover a darn thing.
When he came back, he sort of went into his dad's business, didn't he?
He did to a degree. You know that, of course, he continues to do about 7 sealing voyages. That would have been in the late 1820s that he joined in with his father in terms of building vessels and, more importantly, eventually designing vessels.
Now, the house where your headquarters are, the headquarters of the Stonington Historical Society, was Nathaniel Palmer's house. Did he build it or did his family build it?
He had it built in concert with his next younger brother, Alexander, also an accomplished sea captain, 7 years his junior. This had been his father's land before him and probably even going farther back. Their original house had been, even though he was born down in the village, had been across the street. It burned in 1850. At that time, Nathaniel and Alexander had already made plans to build a home and share it together. And that wasn't really all that unusual back in the day to do so, particularly if you had the combined wealth that both brothers had to build the beautiful structure that this is. This was a point of land that Nathaniel referred to as Pine Point. So they had their eye on this. It's a bit of a promontory. We think it might be 30 feet above sea level. This was a home they always intended to share.
Has anybody ever walked into Nathaniel Palmer's house, now a museum, or the headquarters of the Historical Society, and said, hey, I've been to Antarctica and I'm here to pay homage to him?
Absolutely. I can't say that it happens every day, but we've had people who've gone on cruises to Antarctica, these sort of adventure cruises, you might call them, I guess. But I've also had a couple that came in who ran those cruises and may still. A young couple who periodically go down there and bring people to poke around that area. Also had some recent visitors who said, well, we're going in the fall. They're very excited about it. So sure, we get that quite often.
And they absolutely know the history of Nathaniel Palmer?
I would say negative to that. No, that's probably why they came to the house. They want to know more about Nat, his family, his interests, his accomplishments. We're glad to share as much as we can. And I think that equips them a little bit better to appreciate the conditions under which these men sailed. I just find his character to be one that is a character that I admire. I want to keep digging more and more about things. He's one of those people that when you think, who from history would I like to have dinner with? Well, the list is pretty long, but I think for many of us, he'd be quite towards the top.
That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. The Nathaniel Palmer House is located near the beautiful Stonington Village and Stonington Point, 2 absolute must-see stops in Connecticut if you haven't already been there. And I want to thank our guest for today's program, June Froh, the lead docent at the Nathaniel Palmer House, which is also the Stonington Historical Society in Stonington. Well, the answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, a lot of people like to claim that he spent the night with them. Who was he? Well, the answer, of course, George Washington. Everyone says George Washington slept here, even though it turns out a lot of times those claims are not true. Well, next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to sort out fact from fiction on this question and let you know exactly where in Connecticut George Washington actually did sleep. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.